I would like to acknowledge that we're in Unama'ki, the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq within a broader area, Mi'kma'ki, which in today's geography essentially is the 4 Atlantic provinces, the Gaspésie of Quebec, and part of Maine in the United States. It's really important for people to know that these are the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And oftentimes people will say to me, well, what does unceded mean? It means that the Mi'kmaq signed a treaty of peace and friendship with the British Crown. And I say the British Crown because at that time, they believed that they controlled most of North America. They were fighting with the French over the other half of North America. But in that treaty, they did not cede any land rights. And the King of England was very clear that no Aboriginal title was ever ceded, which means title to these lands remain with Aboriginal peoples. So we are here because the original inhabitants of these lands share them with us. So when we say we're on unceded territory, that's what we mean. Tourism is a vital part of the Cape Breton economy, and it has been for many decades. It provides more than 6,000 jobs, and pre-pandemic, it was valued at $330 million a year. So it's very significant to the overall economy. When tourists think of Cape Breton icons, usually they think of the Cabot Trail, they think of hiking trails, they think of kayaking, they think of the great outdoors. And the real anchor to that on Cape Breton Island has been Parks Canada. So the Highlands National Park, where many of those icons that I talked about, well, they're resident in the federal national park. And Parks Canada have developed it, curated it, marketed it, and has made it a significant attraction. And they're also located in Louisbourg and Bedeque. So when you look at the Parks Canada facilities, they have long been, I would argue, the main and first anchor as far as services to tourists are concerned. And partnering with them, also the federal government, the Cape Breton Development Corporation, which was a federal crown corporation, which many people referred to as DevCo as a short term. Early on DevCo was formed to look at the orderly closure of the coal mines on Cape Breton Island and to diversify the economy outside of coal. And tourism was a natural sector to look at. So DevCo spent a great deal of time looking at what could be. And what attracted them to the tourism sector, in part, was tourism could be spread, or the activities could be spread throughout Cape Breton Island. It wouldn't be centered in one community for employment. It could be everywhere across the island. So DevCo reached the conclusion, correctly or incorrectly, but quoting Tom Kent, who was then the president, he said, "We will be the entrepreneurs." So there were many small operations, but very few that were large operations capable of drawing large numbers of tourists. So DevCo started to develop operations of accommodations, restaurants, attractions, and by the early 80s, mid-80s, DevCo was the largest tourism operator on Cape Breton Island. So owning and operating their own operations. The largest one was Dundee Resort, which still is, but not owned by the federal government anymore. It was developed as a golf course, a restaurant, accommodations, a marina. And the thing about where Dundee is located in Richmond County, in the West Bay of the Bredor Lakes, it was off the beaten track for tourism. And DevCo wanted to see that tourism was spread throughout the island. So it looked at developing attractions or accommodations in areas that historically didn't have them. Now, today, you would say, well, you would have to do a business plan, you'd have to do a marketing plan before you would invest in an area that really wasn't on the main tourism traffic. But DevCo said it had two main objectives for developing its operations. One was to redirect tourism traffic to areas of the island that did not have it, Dundee Resort where it was, and to put their attractions in areas of chronic underemployment or unemployment to create employment in those areas. And they were all rural areas. And that happened. So if you would look at just Dundee Resort as an example, it would never have been placed there if it was based upon market analysis or traffic count. There was essentially no tourists in that area. And Dundee Resort, for example, changed that. And as the DevCo operations became successful, the private sector started saying the government of Canada shouldn't own those. We should own them, we should operate them. And DevCo started a program to privatize its operations, making them available they sold them to the private sector. And many of those operations, the majority of those operations, are still operating 50 years later or 45 years later with higher numbers of people working there, and generating millions of dollars into the economy over decades. So if anyone from DevCo was around now, it doesn't exist anymore, but they would say they were very successful because the two goals that the corporation had were satisfied, and many of those facilities continue to operate today as tourism operators. So pre-pandemic, Cape Breton Island sector was growing the fastest in Atlantic Canada, double-digit growth. And also in what would, one of the measures, room nights sold, meaning how many people actually stay here. In room nights sold, Cape Breton Island was leading Atlantic Canada in growth. So the sector was very dynamic, and then something called COVID happened, which not only shut down the sector here, it shut down the sector in the world. Now, hopefully, we're in a post-pandemic phase. We're seeing indications of growth, and the numbers were reasonably strong in the fall of 22. But COVID isn't over. And there are other international forces that are at play that may impact global travel. At the moment, the early indications are that global travel is significantly increasing, but there's still a lot of unknowns in 23. I find the degree of entrepreneurism and new to the industry, young people who are very smart with market information, with social media savvy, and who are developing unique and highly targeted products for niches within the sector. And I see that happening all over Cape Breton Island. It's happening in accommodations, it's happening in food, it's happening in attractions, and it's targeting a younger demographic. So to me, that's adding a whole other layer to this tourism cluster that I mentioned, becoming even more sophisticated and specifically targeted to a new group. It's not that group was never here before, but these new services or attractions or products I find really exciting when I hear what's available that wasn't available 5 years ago, and indications in 23 and in 24 of significant growth in new areas that to me just adds to the strength of the pre-pandemic Cape Breton Island product, which was strong. The new people entering into the sector, or people in the sector who are doing new innovative things, I think that just makes a strong sector even stronger. I'm Dr. Keith Brown. I've been at Cape Breton University for 32 years, usually in a senior admin role, Vice President International, Vice President Aboriginal Affairs, Vice President External. But I've always taught during that time. I always taught in the BBA program, part-time, and then I started teaching in the MBA program, part-time, and I really enjoyed it. So in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been a full-time professor in the MBA program in Community Economic Development, teaching international business and strategic management, and doing research in the cultural area, tourism area, in cultural tourism. And before that, I was the vice president with the Cape Breton Development Corporation and the director of tourism. So some of that history that I told you about, I lived part of that history with many other people, but so that's what I've always been interested in tourism.